Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate you joining Flex Train this week. So we are continuing our evolution with refrigerants, and this might be the most interesting portion of all. I really had fun diving into the pre-CFC, all of our original refrigerants from back in the 1800s and early 1900s. And then we evolved into our CFC refrigerants that we replaced because of their chlorine content. And then we moved into, because we were simultaneously making HCFCs as well. And then we kind of moved into the HFC refrigerants. And we talked a little bit about our HC or hydrocarbon refrigerants, which have been around for a long time as well. We just didn't use them as much because of their flammability. Well, now we're really starting to pay a lot of attention to an entirely new class of refrigerants called HFOs. And to be honest with you, I knew the refrigerants, I knew what they were, I just didn't know exactly how they were formulated. And I think a lot of people are in that scenario, seeing that we have this hydrofluoroolefin and are really wondering what that olefin portion is about. Because if we look at our previous generation of refrigerants, you could look at the name and tell what that refrigerant was created from. If it was a CFC, it had chlorine, fluorine, and carbon. If it was a HCFC, we had hydrogen, chlorine, fluorine, and carbon. If it was an HFC, we had hydrogen, fluorine, and carbon. And if it was an HC, it was simply hydrogen and carbon. Well, now we have this crazy one that is an HFO, a hydrofluoroolefin. And it kind of caught most of us off guard because we didn't know what that olefin factor is. So this week, we're going to dive into HFOs. So when we look at what an HFO is, we're going to see it as a chemically engineered refrigerant. Most of them are blended refrigerants of different chemicals. This one actually has a little bit of engineering done to it, which was very intriguing. So HFO refrigerants are categorized as having zero ozone depleting potential, typically, not always, but typically, because they don't have any chlorine in them. And they have a very low global warming potential. So they're a very environmentally friendly refrigerant. They are great alternatives to the CFC, HCFCs, and HFC refrigerants. They have very short tropospheric lifetimes due to a reactivity, which is a bond between the carbon molecules. So the bonding between the carbon molecules is really the critical part of the low life expectancy of these HFOs as they enter into the atmosphere. So that quick reactivity, which is from this hydroxyl radical and chlorine radicals that's in the atmosphere that pulls apart these carbon bonds, it prevents them from reacting and reaching the stratosphere. So they do have the same chemical composition. It's just the way that we bond those chemicals that keeps them from rising all the way to the stratosphere. So how does that happen? How does that bond look different than other refrigerants? Well, it's because of this olefin. So if we look at our previous refrigerants are a saturated chemicals. So they're chemicals that are well diluted with each other. Well, with these new formulations, these olefins, they're also called alkenes. It is a compound made up of hydrogen, carbon, but it contains one or more pairs of carbon atoms that are linked with a double bond, not just a single molecular bond between the atoms. It has a pair of bonds that brings those carbon molecules together. So that is what is called an olefin. Now, if we look at the actual refrigerants, we're going to see that chemically they actually look very similar to each other. So if we look at the original bond of CFC12, we had a carbon base. We had fluorine molecules that individually bonded to the carbon, and we had chlorine molecules, or atoms, I'm sorry, that bonded individually to that carbon molecule. Well, when we created R134A, we took out the chlorine, so we just simply had carbon, and we had the same fluorine, and then we added hydrogen. So we essentially replaced the chlorine with hydrogen, right? We created an HFC. And we took two of those carbon atoms and we bonded them together with a single bond. Don't ask me how they do that. That's getting into the whole science thing. And I imagine hopefully this fall, this winter, we'll have someone from the scientific side of chemistry teach us a little bit about how they do it, because it is really fascinating. Well, when we look at some of these newer HFOs like R1234yf, which is the dominant HFO refrigerant, we'll see it is an HFC. It is the same chemicals that went into 134A. That's what caught me off guard, is HFO really is an HFC. What they do is they take the carbon atoms inside of that molecule, and they double bond the carbon molecules to each other. Typically only one, sometimes more, but they'll have at least one set of carbon atoms that are double bonded. And then it still has the fluorine individually bonded to the carbon atoms, and it has the hydrogen individually bonded to the carbon atoms. So it is a modified HFC refrigerant. So we have made a transition in our refrigerants based on how we take our chemicals and we actually bond them together. So our evolution in the CFC refrigerant class, in automotive particularly, Paul, you've seen all these transitions, I'm sure. We started out in R12, we moved into 134A, and then we moved into 1234yf. A lot of people don't understand that we made a quick shift from 134A into 1234yf. And we did that a few years ago. So when we moved into these new multi-class, multi-chemical refrigerants, we actually came up with an additional refrigerant classification scale, and sciencemag.org was really good about explaining how that new classification system works. So when we see these new HFO refrigerant classifications, we will see that they have a 4-letter classification and then typically 1 or 2 letters after that. But our number classification, what we're talking about is the actual atoms that are inside of that molecule. So with our previous refrigerants, we did the same thing. We never wanted to have a 0 there, so we left out zeros. So we either have to add 1 or subtract 1 from our number, just making sure that we're no zeros in our classification. So in these new classifications, our R is just, it's a refrigerant, so it still gets the R classification. The first number in our classification is going to be the number of double bonded carbon atoms. So remember, it is a double bond in there. So with 1234yf, we have a single double bond. Our second number is the number of carbon atoms minus 1, so it's never a 0. So we're going to look at that R1234yf, and we're going to see that we would have 3 carbon atoms inside of that. So it's going to be 3 minus 1, so it's going to be 2. The number of hydrogen atoms plus 1. So if we look at that, we have 2 hydrogen atoms on that thing. So we add 1 to it, and that gives us our 3. And then number 4 is the number of fluorine atoms. So in this particular one, we have 4 fluorine atoms. So in R1234yf, we have 3 carbon atoms, we have 2 hydrogen atoms, and we have 4 fluorine atoms. So it is an HFC refrigerant that has been modified in its carbon bonding to become an olefin. So it is an HFO now. So our new HFO refrigerants are absolutely modified HFCs. And there are a variety of them in there. And the most interesting thing about it, in some of these new HFO refrigerants, we've even added our old predecessor that we took out decades ago, chlorine. So because of our olefin bonding of our carbon atoms, we can actually reintroduce chlorine into some of these refrigerants because they will actually dissolve very quickly in the atmosphere and they never reach the stratosphere. So you'll even see some refrigerants out there like HCFO. It's not just HFO, it's HCFO 1224YD. That is carbon based, so it has carbon atoms at its core. It adds fluorine, it adds hydrogen, and chlorine. So variety of new HFO refrigerants that has carbon base, has hydrogen, has fluorine, and occasionally even has chlorine mixed into it. So the shift that we made from our CFC refrigerants into these new HFOs really was based on global warming potential. Because if we talk about 1980s, 1990s, generation where I was in school, all we talked about was the hole in the ozone. So all of our refrigerants were removed because of their effect on the ozone. By the time we got into the 2000s and we started focusing on global warming, so then we started re-looking at all of our refrigerants going, okay, global warming now has to be addressed pretty quickly. So with R12, CFC R12, we had a global warming potential of 10,900, and it had ozone depleting potential, which is why we got rid of it. We moved into R134A, did not have ozone depleting potential, but had a global warming potential 1,430 times that of CO2. We also have out there a potential replacement, which we'll talk about in a minute, called R152A. It is an HFC refrigerant, but it has a much lower global warming potential than the 134A does. Remember, right now, the goal in the United States is 750 global warming potential and less. All refrigerants across the board. So this 152A has some potential to be a replacement for R134A. Then we have our R1234yf, which has a global warming potential of 4, and we have CO2, which is the base for all of our refrigerants, and it has the lowest global warming potential of 1. So interestingly enough, when EPA started looking at the replacement refrigerants, they knew that they had to get rid of R12, they knew that they had to get rid of R134A, so they created a standard in January 1st of 2017 for motor vehicles that mandated the transition to refrigerants with a global warming potential below 150. So all the refrigerants going into motor vehicles needs to be below 150 GWP, which means 134A did not fit that category. Well, a lot of people didn't realize that in 2016, we already started that transition. We knew that this was coming. A lot of the manufacturers said, hey, we know that it's coming. Let's just go ahead and do that. We've got a refrigerant. Let's go ahead and make the transition now. So in 2016, most manufacturers of non-commercial vehicles switched from R134A over to R1234yf. 2016. I didn't even know that until I started doing the EPA classes here 3 years ago, and I went, wow, that's weird. So I went out to my truck and looked, and I'll show you here in just a minute what I found in 2016. So what they decided, what the EPA decided, and this all comes from EPA.gov, is that one of their potential replacements was R1234yf, has a GWP of 4. It is mildly flammable, but it is not self-igniting, so it has to have a consistent flame source. It will not maintain, or will not propagate a flame on its own. So just a spark may light it, but it won't stay lit. It has to have a constant flame to be able to have an ignition, and it's not a full flame like you would expect to see like off propane or gas or something. It just has more of a flutter to it. So it was a very good potential replacement for that 134A. They also, this was very intriguing to me, they also accepted CO2 as a replacement for 134A. The downfall of CO2 is that it has a operating pressure, a high side pressure, 5 to 10 times that of other refrigerants. So extremely high head pressure. Remember, we've talked about this before when we were talking about CO2. The only reason we don't use CO2 is because of its high operating pressures. But it is approved as a refrigerant for automotive air conditioning systems. We also have this 152A that has been approved by the EPA. It has a GWP of 124, so 1/10 of that of R134A. So it has the ability to be a potential HFC replacement, almost a drop-in replacement for 134A. I haven't seen it in any vehicles yet, but it absolutely has been approved by the EPA for motor vehicles. So when we look at the chemical compositions of those, if we see that R12, it has a carbon atom at its core. It's surrounded by chlorine atoms and fluorine atom, and had a high GWP. It is non-flammable, but it has an atmospheric life of 100 years, which means once it gets into the stratosphere, it will destroy ozone molecules for about 100 years. So all of the R12 that is in the atmosphere is going to be doing damage for a while. We are starting to slowly see a decline in our ozone depletion. That's because our R12 that we used to use is slowly starting to die out. So then we made the shift into 134A. which is an HFC refrigerant. So it has a carbon core to it, has a carbon atoms at the center of it. It is surrounded by fluorine and hydrogen, no chlorine. It is non-flammable, and it has an atmospheric life of about 14 years. So a lot less than R12, but still pretty significant with a high GWP of 1400. So if we look at our 1234yf, that is our new HFO refrigerant, which is a modified HFC. It has carbon atoms at its core. It's surrounded by hydrogen atoms and fluorine atoms, but because of that unique bond between the carbon atoms, we now have that olefin factor, and it gives it a low GWP because it disperses very quickly as it goes into the atmosphere. All of our molecules, all of our atoms break apart pretty easily. It is slightly flammable, and the cool thing about 1234yf is its atmospheric life is only 11 days. So once it's released out of a vehicle, out of a system, it is dissipated in 11 days. That's a whole lot better than 100 years or 14 years. The 152A, that is another potential replacement for the HFC refrigerant class. It has a low GWP of 124. It is a non-flammable refrigerant, which is really good. So states like California, I could see being very interested in R152A versus 1234yf. And it has an atmospheric life of 1.4 years. So it falls in between 1234yf and 134A. And it's an HFC, which means it could be a potential drop-in replacement. 1234yf is not a drop-in replacement for 134A. You have to have a completely redesigned system. So they operate very differently. So that is our primary HFO replacement, is in the 134A class. So if you look at the difference molecularly between 134A and 1234yf, they have the same chemicals. They have the same atoms in them. They're just bonded a little bit differently, and then we add an extra carbon atom inside of that 1234yf. But chemically, they are very, very much the same. Not as different as I expected them to be once I started building this program. So if you look at a 2016 Dodge Ram 3500 with the Cummins diesel, it is not in the light vehicle class. It is in a commercial class. And in 2016, it came with R134A refrigerant with PAG oil with about 1.31 pounds of refrigerant. If you look at my truck, 2016 Ram 1500, so the light duty version of the same truck, it came with 1.125 pounds of R1234yf. So automotive manufacturers in 2016, preparing for that 2017 mandate, shifted from R134A to 1234yf across the board. So don't be surprised, pop your hood and go, wow, I can't go to AutoZone and buy a can of 134A for my vehicle now. Got to remember, that was one of the most largest leaking refrigerant systems in our world. It was our automotive systems. Because what happened if your air conditioner was low on refrigerant or out of refrigerant? You went to AutoZone, you went to Walmart, you went wherever, and you bought 1 pound cans of 134A because it did not require a license, and you put a pound in. And the next time it stopped working, you put another pound or 2 in it. So we were constantly leaking 134A into our atmosphere. So we took that by the reins in 2017, and we mandated that be less than 150. So 1234yf is here to stay. And by the way, 1234yf is manufactured by our good friends at Hfo Refrigerants. And the funny thing about all of this, and I can kick myself in the butt, for those of you that were on Flex Train a year ago, and we were talking about 1234yf being an emerging refrigerant, and we started talking about Hfo, and I made a comment, said, boy, now would be a good time to buy stock in Hfo. Well, I called my financial guy and was telling him about, oh, I was excited about this Hfo company. They're friends of the show, and they're making this 1234yf, and it's going to be going into so many new applications. And my guy at Edward Jones was kind of like, yeah, I don't know. Doesn't really look like it's that steady of a stock. I don't. You can invest if you want to, but I don't think it's a good one. Well, we had some friends of the show invest in stock, and one of them constantly reminds me how well he is doing. I just got a text message a couple days ago saying that his stock is now 4 times the value that it was a year ago.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy? That's crazy. So
Yeah.
12334yf is here to stay, folks. So 12334yf. It can be used with PAG oil in the automotive industry. It can be used with POE oil, which is most of us are familiar with it. It's what we use for R410A. Has a nice global warming potential of 4. It's a pretty dang good refrigerant. It is flammable. It's actually considered extremely flammable in some label systems. It is a flammable refrigerant, which is why we didn't go with it a long time ago. Now, when we talk about 1234yf, we also need to talk about 1234ze. Another one of its coparts. 1234ze has a GWP of 7. It likes POE oil. It is an A2L, so it is a flammable refrigerant, but it is starting to already be utilized in supermarket refrigeration and heat pump systems around the world. So 1234ze is a very, very potential refrigerant replacement for R410A. And it is an HFO class refrigerant. We do have another one out there called 1233ZD. It's one of the HFO brothers of 1234, and it is used for foam blowing applications. Got to remember, we've been using refrigerants for our foam blowing processes as well. And if we're blowing foam, all of the refrigerant that was used to blow that foam and inject that foam into like panels and into cabinets, that was just being released into the atmosphere. So you'll see 1233ZD and HFO going into aerosols and foam blowing applications. If we look at R32, you've heard us talk about R32 quite a bit. Most of the world went with R32 when the United States went with R410A. They went with R32 because it was a very low GWP compared to R410A. It has a global warming potential of 675. It likes POE oil. It is slightly flammable, but it is an HFC refrigerant. So a lot of the world went with R32, and you're going to see R32 coming back into the residential and commercial HVAC industry. Daikin is going back to R32, and that is going to be their primary refrigerant for commercial package units, PTAC units, and very likely residential. That's the hangup right now, is no one knows exactly what the long-term replacement for R410A is. You're going to see an introduction of a variety of different ones. You'll see 1234ZE, you're going to see R32, you're going to see some combinations of those, because if we look at R454B, you remember when Puron came out? Carrier came out with Puron, right? Remember what Puron actually was? It was R410A. And if you all remember, R410A was a 50-50 blend of R32, which was a slightly flammable refrigerant, mixed with R125, which was a flame deterrent. So R410A is a blended refrigerant of R32 and 125. Well, Carrier is coming out with a new refrigerant. It's called Puron 2 or New Puron. So this will be Carrier's refrigerant that they're going to put in their commercial HVAC equipment and potentially in the residential market as well. Not been designated residential yet, has absolutely been designated for their commercial equipment. R410A is gone in commercial equipment, at least in package units particularly. So Daikin will be going with R32 along with most of the industry. Carrier is going to be going with 454B. So if you look at R454B, you're going to see real quick what it is. They'll call it Puron. They'll call it all sorts of things. You know, we're just here to be real. We're here to talk about things for what they really are. We're here to tear stuff apart to see what's actually not being told. And here's what's not being told. R454B is a blend of R32 and 1234yf. That new HFO refrigerant.
JCI is going with R454B also.
Are they really?
Yep, they announced it just not too long ago.
Interesting. So that will be your primary 410A replacement refrigerants, R32 and blended R32, called R454B. Both really good refrigerants. I mean, if you look at that, that now gives us a GWP of 467. So where a lot of this came from is California was trying to mandate that all refrigerants be 500 GWP and less. Well, R32 alone could not hit that. So basically that was leaving out everything manufactured by Daikin, because remember, Daikin owns R32. So they're sticking with R32. That's what they own. That's what they manufacture. They actually bought their own manufacturing facility. I think it was in Argentina. Very, very large refrigerant manufacturing facility. And they pump out R32 because that is their primary refrigerant. So there was that potential that there would be no Daikin equipment in California. So that was accepted nationally at 750 GWP. So that allows R32 to be in there. That allows 454B to be in there. And that will be your primary refrigerants going forward, unless we get into 1234ZE or 152 or something of that nature. But your likely replacements, your probable replacements for R410A, at least in the near future, is going to be HFO R454B and HFC R32. So lots and lots and lots of interesting information on HFO refrigerants and how they really are modified HFC refrigerants.
Can I ask you a quick question?
You betcha.
I'm just curiosity, the automotive background in me. Jump back to those two trucks, those 2016s.
Yeah.
Were they both regular cab?
Both extended cabs.
Both extended cab, but just front air, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious the poundage difference. 1.31 pounds for
1.3 and 1.15.
Okay, so that's not even that far off.
Not
Okay.
much at all. That 1234yf has a slightly less charge capacity than the 134A.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I would say that it probably is the same refrigeration package. Both of those are quad cab trucks.
Okay.
So should have the same BTU capacity in those.
Yep. Very good.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Anybody else have any questions or comments about the shift into HFO refrigerants? The fun topic. All right. Well, I sure thank everyone for joining us today, and hope you all have a wonderful day and enjoy your upcoming weekend. And we will see you all next week on Flex Train as we talk about future refrigerants.